As we continue on today in our sermon series of God's wisdom is more valuable than gold, today we'll be talking about being wise about alcohol. A few scripture references today. Actually, there are more than these, but Proverbs 20, verse 1, Proverbs 23, 29 through 35, Proverbs 31, 4 through 7. The story is told about a preacher who decided to have a visual demonstration to add emphasis to his Sunday sermon. So he placed 4 jars in front of the congregation and put a worm in each jar. The first worm was put into a jar of alcohol. The second worm was put into a jar of cigarette smoke. And the third was put into a jar of chocolate syrup. And the fourth was put into a jar of good, clean soil. At the conclusion of the sermon, the preacher checked on the worms and reported the following results. The worm in the alcohol was dead. The worm in the cigarette smoke was dead. The worm in the chocolate syrup was dead. And the worm in the good soil was alive. Then the preacher asked the congregation, "What can we learn from this demonstration?" The little old lady in the back quickly raised her hand and said, "Well, if it looks like if you drink and smoke and eat chocolate, you won't have worms." I don't think that's what the preacher was talking about. As you know, in this sermon series on the book of Proverbs, we're trying to find and absorb and apply God's wisdom, which is more valuable than gold, to our lives. Today we're going to talk about being wise about alcohol. And what we learned today about alcohol also applies to other drugs as well. I'm thankful by the grace of God, alcohol and these other drugs have never been a problem for me. Even though I've had access to alcohol as a young person, was surrounded by a father who took an occasional drink, I don't say any of this to brag about myself or pat myself on the back, but I want you to know that as I speak about this subject, I do so as someone who has not been a struggle or a problem. For that, I'm very thankful. But I know some hearing this sermon today may have had or are now having very different experience with alcohol and other drugs. I want to share the testimony of a preacher in California named Timothy Peck. When Timothy preached on the subject of alcohol, he shared his story of struggle with alcohol. Timothy said, "I was 12 years old when I took my first drink. My mom and adopted father were hosting a Christmas party for several of their friends, and they had an open bar. And the more the booze flowed, the less people noticed that I was helping myself to the orange juice and vodka drink they call screwdrivers. I don't remember exactly how many screwdrivers I drank, but I do remember spending the night throwing up in the bathroom. I also remember feeling absolutely awful the next day. In fact, I couldn't drink orange juice without feeling like I was going to throw up for months after that. Any normal person would have learned from that experience, but for me, that night was just the beginning. However, I wasn't just a normal person. Within a week, I was regularly sneaking into my parents' liquor cabinet. I didn't care what I drank. Bourbon, vodka, brandy, didn't matter. The drink was just the delivery system. What I was interested in was the effect. Alcohol provided a numbness from the pain and confusion I was going through as a 12-year-old. Timothy continued, I didn't stop drinking, and I didn't stop drinking. Soon I was experimenting with drugs as well. And by the time I was 13 years old, I was a daily drug abuser. I tried everything I could get my hands on, marijuana, pills, meth, angel dust, LSD. The only thing I never tried was heroin. I figured if I avoided that, I wasn't a drug addict. For 6 years, I drank and abused drugs on a regular basis. In fact, I can't remember one sober day from the time I was 12 until the time I quit when I was 18. My grades went from being A's to B's to F's. My last year of junior high school, I was suspended 3 times, getting into trouble. In fact, I failed all but one of my classes my last semester, but the school graduated me anyway, just to move me on to high school. That summer between junior high and high, I moved here at Upland, and I didn't get into as much trouble here, but it wasn't because I didn't deserve it. I continued to abuse drugs and alcohol on a daily basis as I coasted through high school in a continual mental haze. Timothy concluded it was only through my involvement with Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous when I was 18 that I was able to finally break free from my addiction, and it was easy to imagine my drug alcohol problem wasn't really that bad after all. I only used drugs and drank for 6 years. Yet, during those 6 years, my life spun out of control. I was unable to sustain healthy relationships. I consistently turned to drugs and alcohol to numb my pain and cope with my life. I was young, but I was truly an alcoholic and a drug addict. Now, I wanted to share Timothy's story today for 2 reasons. First, maybe your story is more like Timothy's than my story, so you need to know that you're not alone and that others have struggled just like you. Second, I wanted to share my story, his story, because it's one of victory. He got help and continues to get help and is able to live life that pleases God and even serve in full-time ministry. As we turn to the book of Proverbs, we'll discover that Proverbs has a lot to say about abuse of alcohol and the damage it can have in a person's life. There are 3 significant texts in Proverbs that warn against the dangers of alcohol, and I want us to look at each of them and see what they advise concerning that use. I'd like us to notice the 3 things that Proverbs warns us about the use of alcohol. Number 1, alcohol intoxication has serious consequences. So let's start with a short verse in Proverbs 20, verse 1. Wine is a mocker, beer is a brawler. Whoever goes astray because of them is not wise. Solomon wants us to understand that alcohol often causes people to behave as mockers and brawlers. The word translated mocker is the same as scoffer. The scoffer in Proverbs is not only unwise, but is actually anti-wisdom. Drinkers of alcohol often become belligerent and foolish. We all know what it means for someone to become a brawler. Alcohol causes many people to be more mellow, but others, it causes them to be more aggressive and angry, and they lose all self-control. So let's turn to the more extensive passage in Proverbs 23, verses 29 through 35. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has conflicts? Who has complaints? Who has wounds for no reason? Who has red eyes? Those who linger over wine, those who go looking for mixed wine. Don't gaze at wine because it is red, because it gleams in the cup and goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a snake and stings like your viper. Your eyes will see strange things, and you will say absurd things. You will be like someone sleeping at sea or lying down on the top of a ship's mast. They struck me, but I feel no pain. They beat me, but I didn't know it. When will I wake up? I'll look for another drink. Psalms 23, verses 29 through 35. This text is a part of a larger discussion beginning with verse 1 that concerns the dangers of gluttony, illicit sex, and drinking. The overall point, though, considering these things, is the need for self-discipline. As we work through this passage, we're going to see 3 warnings about alcohol. So let's start breaking this thing down and just looking at verses 29 and 30. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has conflicts? Who has complaints? Who has wounds for no reason? Who has red eyes? Those who linger over wine, those who go looking for mixed wine. Again, Proverbs 23, 29, and 30. In these two verses, we find 6 different consequences of intoxication, and each consequence is a form of rhetorical question. One consequence is despair, and we find the question, who has woe? The Hebrew word translated woe here is the expression of despair, a feeling of hopelessness, of impending doom. Woe is that overwhelming feeling that there's no way out. And the life is crushing you and grinding you to bits, and there's nothing you can do about it. The feeling of woe is often communicated in suicide notes, and is no coincidence that a high percentage of suicide attempts each year are related to drug and alcohol use. Another consequence of alcohol intoxication is sorrow. The Hebrew word for sorrow in this second question is literally ouch. It's an exclamation of pain. Sorrow is anguish and distress, a life filled with inner pain. The question, who is strife, focuses on consequences of broken relationships. Strife is a general word that refers to arguments with other people. Again, it's no coincidence that 80% of all domestic abuse in our nation is alcohol-related. Strife also includes bar fights, brawls after sporting events, also includes hurtful words, hastily spoken, angry actions, and so forth. Amazing. After Kansas City won the Super Bowl last year, they had a mass shooting. They were supposed to be celebrating a great win. And here they are shooting each other. Unbelievable. The question about having complaints points to problems as a consequence of intoxication. A complaint is a description of a problem or difficulty in one's life. In other words, intoxication with alcohol will cause a person to have lots of problems and difficulties that they wouldn't otherwise have had. Whether it's a suspended driver's license because of a DUI or an unwanted pregnancy, or whether it's a ruined relationship or a lost job. Another one, bruises, needless bruises, if you will, focuses on bodily injury as a consequence of intoxication. Drugs and alcohol affect a person's coordination and equilibrium. Just as your equilibrium and your coordination decline the more you drink, your judgment also declines, so you tend to do more dangerous things, yet physically you're least prepared to maneuver those dangerous things. Whether it's driving a car while intoxicated, jumping off a rock into a lake, intoxicated people take needless risks that often harm themselves. It's not a coincidence that 60% of all emergency room admissions are alcohol-related. Finally, red eyes refers to the bloodshot eyes, dull senses. When a person is drunk or wasted, their ability to see, hear, or think is dulled. As you can see, there are severe consequences, and Proverbs encourages us to understand the consequences of intoxication. Warning number 2. The lure of alcohol is deceptive. So let's continue with Proverbs and look at verses 31 and 32. Don't gaze at wine because it is red, because it gleams in the cup, because it goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a snake and stings like a viper. Proverbs 23, verses 31 and 32. Even back when Proverbs was written, people who produced wine tried to make it look cool and refreshing. It gleams in the cup. Think of the beer and wine commercials and advertising when they show wine in the glass. It looks so good, and the beer can or bottle has the cool perspiration running down it, or the foam rises being poured into the glass. It looks so good. And all the people in the commercials look so good and happy. And the most interesting man in the world not only drinks, but is perpetually thirsty. The drinking alcohol is also always associated with good times, ball games, tailgate parties, gatherings on the beaches, and always in the companies of a lot of pretty people. What the alcohol and advertisers are really selling is a fantasy. It goes down smoothly, but bites and stings like a snake. What they do not show are the victims of automobile accidents caused by drunk drivers, or the domestic quarrels that frequently erupt as a result of drinking, or the spousal abuse, or children caught in the middle of the chaos, or the crimes that people frequently commit under the influence. They don't show the drunk tank at the local jail, or the red eyes and the swollen faces of intoxicated people, or the jobs lost due to their overindulgence. Think about the famous people who've struggled with or been destroyed by drugs and alcohol. Betty Ford, Amy Winehouse, Len Bias, Matthew Perry, Whitney Houston, and Elvis Presley. Intoxication is foolish, and it causes foolishness. The devil is so crafty, and he wraps sin in such an attractive disguise, but it never delivers what it promises. Never. What looks good turns out to be so bad. What looks like such fun turns out to be disastrous. What promises freedom and turns into a trap, which leads to our last warning today. Warning number 3. Alcohol has addictive power. Here's the rest of Proverbs 23. Your eyes will see strange things, and you will say absurd things. You will be like someone sleeping out in the sea or lying down on the top of a ship's mast. They struck me, but I feel no pain. They beat me, but I didn't know it. And when I wake up, I'll look for another drink. Proverbs 23, 33 through 35. Here we notice the consequences are described in vivid detail for us. A person intoxicated by drugs or alcohol will see strange things. Hallucinations aren't unusual among drug abusers and long-term alcoholics. In fact, some drugs actually specialize in producing hallucinations. The second half of verse 33 is interesting. Notice what's underlined here. The CSV says you will say absurd things. The NIV says your mind will imagine confusing things. The New American Standard Bible says your mind will say perverse things. In the Hebrew, it literally reads, your mind will tell you opposite things. This refers to thoughts that are contrary to what you know to be true and right. This is distorted, impaired judgment. Your mind will whisper ideas to you that are totally out of character with what you believe and what you think is right. This explains why a person is totally against drunk driving, suddenly grabs his keys to go for a ride after a few beers. Why? His mind is telling him things are contrary to what he really believes and knows. Verse 34 describes the drunken experience of feeling like you're being tossed about. I've experienced vertigo and it isn't fun. Experience is when everything is spinning. I'm told that when you're really drunk, every time you close your eyes, you feel like you're spinning around. And there's one reason an intoxicated person makes many want to throw up. Intoxication numbs the pain, which is why some people get drunk in the first place. The most serious thing of all is the last phrase. And when he wakes up, his only thought is where to find the next drink. And when the cycle starts all over again. The person who drinks too much gradually becomes captive to the power of addiction. Let's be sure to make this clarification. The wise man of Proverbs isn't describing the effects of drinking minimal amounts of alcohol. Rather, he's talking about drunkenness. Nevertheless, our senses can become impaired long before we reach that obviously drunken stage, and because the alcohol's effect, we most likely won't recognize our condition. In the end, how does a person know whether or not they are addicted to alcohol? The only way to know if you're in control of the alcohol is in control is not to drink at all and see how long you can go without a drink. I know when I was a young man, in fact, I was a still young Christian, I became concerned about myself, how much alcohol I was drinking a day and a week and all that. And so I decided to take this challenge on myself to stop. Well, during that time, my brother-in-law and I were eating every Friday night, and we'd go out and get some fresh fish and cook the fish and have several beers with him. Well, still did that, but I just didn't drink any beer with him. He got so angry with me because I wouldn't drink with him. But it was necessary for me to understand where I stood. I needed to go through that. There's only one way to do it: stop. There's another passage in Proverbs that I want us to spend a minute with. It's Proverbs 31, 4 through 7. It is not for kings, Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to desire beer. Otherwise he will drink, forget what is decreed, and pervert justice for all the oppressed. Give beer to the one who is dying, and wine to the one whose life is bitter. Let him drink so he can forget his poverty and remember his trouble no more. Again, Proverbs 31, 4 through 7. Here are the words of King Lemuel's mother taught him. After warning him about the dangers of sexual promiscuity in verses 2 and 3, she didn't just advise him against getting drunk, but advised him against drinking at all. Why is it not for kings to drink wine and beer? Because they have better things to do with their time, and their drinking will hinder their thinking. Kings and rulers need their wits about them if they're going to rule wisely and fairly. Verses 6 and 7 suggest that alcohol is a drug that can be helpful to the dying and miserable to ease their pain. It's not a good idea for the king to be a drinker, and it's also probably not a good idea for the child of the king or kings to be a drinker. Don't we have more important things to do? Don't we need our wits about us as we try to live to God in a godless world? 1 Peter 5:8 says, bringing it to the New Testament, "Be sober-minded, you adversary is the devil, prowling around like a roaring lion, looking for someone he can devour." 1 Peter 5 through 8. So how are we going to be wary and watchful if we're drunk? We need to be sober-minded. And then Paul tells the Ephesians in Ephesians 5:18, "And don't get drunk with wine, which leads to reckless living, but be filled with the Spirit." So he says, don't do the bad, but here's what you can do for the good to help you. I like that. Give me something good to do, Paul. Give me something I can do, put in place of that. Being intoxicated with the spirits leads to reckless, immoral living, but being filled with the Holy Spirit leads to life and godliness. I hope today's study of Proverbs will help us be wise about alcohol. I want to encourage us to make godly choices about drinking and alcohol, and not to judge others about their choices, while at the same time not allowing our liberty to lead others into sin. In Romans 14, Paul gives an extensive discussion where he clearly teaches both things. First, Christians should not pass judgment on others when they differ over personal choices about disputed matters. And second, that Christians should be careful not to put stumbling blocks or hazards in front of others that cause them to sin. And Paul concludes this way in Romans 14. "Do not tear down God's work because of food. Everything is clean, but it is wrong to make someone fall by what he eats. It is a good thing not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that makes your brother or sister stumble. Whatever you believe about these things, keep between yourself and God. Blessed is the one who does not condemn himself by what he approves. Romans 14:20 through 22. Many Christians have chosen that it is in their best interest and the best interest of others that they not drink alcohol at all. Why? First, a person doesn't have to be drunk to be a hazard to themselves and others. Second, since drinking impairs judgment, the danger of becoming drunk while drinking is always present and increases with every drink they take. Third, in some instances, exercising my liberty to drink may cause someone else to sin. Drinking but not becoming drunk isn't wrong, but it can become wrong, and it has a negative impact on others. Fourth, drinking alcohol isn't necessary, and no one is ever negatively impacted by the decision not to drink unless their decision becomes a judgment and condemnation of others. Just as the Bible warns against drunkenness, it also warns against judgmentalism. Beyond our understanding of Scripture or the things that we've been taught about alcohol, often our attitudes about alcohol are shaped by our experiences with it. Some say that drinking alcohol is viewed as a negative and dangerous because it has negatively impacted their lives and personally directly because of their own addiction or addiction of their family members. For others, using alcohol in moderation was a part of their upbringing, but it was a normal part of life, and just as it was in biblical times. But even when alcohol isn't abused, there is always the looming danger of abuse, and the consequence that as a result, as we have seen in our study of today's Proverbs. Before we end, let me point out something that most of us are aware of. A problem with alcohol is often hereditary, whether it be the result of biology or environment. Earlier, I shared the experience and testimony of Timothy Peck in his story of addiction. An additional part of his story includes this. Timothy says, I suspect I had an inclination to drug and alcohol addiction long before I drank that first drink or abused my first drug. After substance abuse runs in my family, my biological father had a drug and alcohol problem. His father had a drinking problem. My mom had her own battles with drug and alcohol abuse. Some of my earliest memories as a child are being in a room watching a bunch of adults smoke pot. It wasn't a matter of if I was going to follow suit. It was a matter of when. I don't know whether it was in my DNA or simply growing up in that environment. But I was an alcoholic and an addict, simply waiting for my first drink and my first high. Now, today I don't have time for us to discuss whether or not alcoholism or addiction are a disease. But one thing I know for sure is that we are responsible for our own choices. That I do know. Any of us may have an inclination or a propensity towards something sinful, whether it be lust or greed or pride or anger or intoxication. But all of us are responsible for how we handle those temptations and our inclinations. Whenever someone is trying to overcome an addiction to alcohol or other drugs, then they will need to address the physical dimension of addiction, the emotional dimension of the addiction, and spiritual dimension of the addiction. Ultimately, the solution to addiction isn't a prescription or a therapy session, but a spiritual transformation. That's what has to happen. True recovery comes from being changed by God as we acknowledge we can't change without His power. If you've never had a problem with alcohol or other drugs, then I hope you never will. If you're personally having a problem with them, then please know that you're not alone in your struggle, and know that you're still loved and valued in the midst of your struggle. There are brothers and sisters in Christ in this church family who have struggled and overcome these kinds of addictions. There are others in the family who are presently working the problem. God cares. And we care, and we're ready to love you. We're ready to love you through it. I hope and pray that all of us will be wise about alcohol. But whatever your need this morning, will you come forward as we stand and sing the song of invitation?